Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jonathan Abear, and I'm the organizer of the JavaScript group. Today, we're meeting in this smaller space, and I know it's a little bit warm in here. I told them to turn the air on, but they said they can control the air, but not the temperature. So I apologize if it's a little bit warm. Normally we're in the big space, but we got bumped by a bigger, more important group or something. So tonight we're going to have a talk from Nick Castrop of SpareFoot, and they are graciously providing the pizza and the water. So thank you to SpareFoot. And Nick's going to come up and give a talk about React, and then we have the room until 9 o'clock. And so after the talk, I'm sure it won't go all the way till 9 p.m. But you guys are free to mingle or hang out up here. Just do me a favor and clean up your space when you're done, and that's it. So just for people who have never been before, we always have our meetups on the first Thursday of the month, and they're almost always here at the Capital Factory. From time to time, we do meet at different spots around town. Our companies host us, so if you're working for a company that's interested in sponsoring, it's super simple. You just pay me $250, and then I order the Papa John's, and that's it. And then you get to talk to the group about opportunities or whatever. And if you're interested in speaking, then I need to talk to you, because the speaker slots always need to be filled. There's only one rule about the talks. They have to have some component of JavaScript in them. So as long as it's about JavaScript, you can give a talk. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be like industry leader or thought leader in the area. The idea of the group is that we can all just come together and share interesting things, and if you think you're working on something cool, you probably are. So come up and talk about it. There's unlimited things in the JavaScript and web world that we can talk about. So that's how I find my speakers. You just go on the site and email me, and you're the next speaker. So thank you all for coming. I want to invite Katie from SpareFoot to come up. She's just going to tell you a little bit about what they got going on, and then we'll get right to the talk.
Hey everybody. Hey. Hey, my name is Katie Smith. I am the recruiter at SpareFoot. And don't know if y'all know a lot about SpareFoot, but we're the world's largest online marketplace for self-storage. We were actually started in this building in Capital Factory a little over 5 years ago, so it's kind of like we're at our old stomping grounds a little bit. But we've grown to around 190 employees right now. So we are recruiting a lot. We have a front-end developer position open and a mobile web developer. If you're interested in chatting about those, just come talk to me. I'll be here all night, and without further ado, I'll let Nick take over now.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
All right.
Hey everybody. I'm Nick. I work at SpareFoot, and I'm a front-end developer. I've been doing this for a while. The last 6 months, I switched over to using Facebook's React and their Flux architecture. So I'm going to give a little talk on that. Just curious, is anyone using React or the... Okay, 5, you guys all grouped together. That's... Okay, so... Let me,
Can we turn the other one on?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll get on strongest mind meld with it.
All right, like I said, 6 months ago I started looking at frameworks, and I was intrigued by React. And so the more I dug into React, I learned about their new architecture that supports their framework or their library called Flux. And since I've been working on it, it's been a pretty good time. Not just Flux and React, but I've switched over to a few new tools. I discovered Browserify, Gulp, React and Flux, and then obviously, we're all familiar with Node. But these tools, for me, have really taken a workflow or my daily life from way back 10 years ago when I started this. It was like the most painful experience in the world. You had to deal with the browser incompatibilities and just a lack of libraries, and you're mostly writing a lot of code that was pretty horrific. So about 5 years ago, when Node came on the scene, there was a big explosion. I think that was partly because Node allowed traditional server-side, like traditional, say, like CS or engineers to start writing some JavaScript on the server. But I think NPM was the largest component of that, and the mindset behind like small modules that do one thing and do them well. Once, like browsers started taking some of the processing load off of the server, people started implementing the same paradigms or design patterns that they had in the, in the other paradigms, in the other worlds. So MVC was a natural place. I mean, it's very similar to the original MVC framework for Smalltalk. You have, a controller that's sitting in front of your views and models, ushering information between the two, and then you have your views, which are rendering the information, and then kind of like a message stream or a bus between your models and views. And the very first tool that I became familiar with was that kind of implemented a slight version of MVC. There's like MV star. Well, the only thing that Backbone didn't really have was controllers. They had these routes, which I kind of modified to act as a controller. I've been in a PHP position before, and it was like, your controllers were responsible for aggregating all your models or all your data and then infusing it into your views and then pushing that out to the client. And my life got infinitely better when I discovered React.js. Instead of having these monolithic files, I can now break up things and this tool wrap them through the Require Optimizer. If you guys, anyone using React.js? Who switched over to Browserify? Well, the boilerplate or the amount of like code that goes into React.js initially, because there was like this wild west of just writing modules willy-nilly and spaghetti code. When Require came out, I was more than willing to wrap everything in a defined statement and these silly arrays that pass into a function. If you've never used it, it's kind of verbose, but it gets the job done. You don't pollute the global namespace, like the window object. And it really was the very first like resource management tooling for client-side development that I came across. I know there were other ones. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I think Require.js was the first, well, it was the most popular, I'd say. It's the one I discovered, and if I discovered it, it had to be the most popular, because I didn't look very hard. So then the last piece of my original like transition from just being like, kind of hack on the JavaScript side was when Grunt was introduced to me. This allowed me to, well, if you combined it with Require, there's a task that will actually like go through your whole dependency graph and compile it all together in one file, and then once you have that file, you can minimize it, you can obfuscate it, and Grunt also has tasks for everything under the sun, whether it's regular expressions or processing SAS or less, or you name it, there's a task for it. And so this was pretty good. I was pretty happy with like this as my development environment, and there was probably 3 or 4 years. I'd been working at SpareFoot for a full year. I was at this other place. I was at the Capital Factory for 3 months. I was at another Austin startup for about 1.5 years. So about 2 years I was using this particular workflow or set of tools. Made my life, I finally started to feel, I'd done some ActionScript like 2.0 in the past, and I felt like I was really programming JavaScript or like doing real, there were classes and interface, and it was great. But I hadn't really experienced that in, without plugins, without using the Flash player or anything like. But this setup was pretty good. I felt like it was about as good as it could get. But I was wrong. I was introduced, so after 2 years or 2.5 years or whatever, I was like, stuff gets boring. So I started looking around when there was a new position in or there was a chance to change teams. And I'd been working in the previous slides, like that tool chain. And so I started looking around because this was going to be a little more intensive of an application. Like it was going to have to be pretty performant. And I was hearing good things about React. The first thing that kind of put me off was this like JSX, like the declarative nature of, JSX is like an extension of JavaScript, but it's kind of like XML, and XML has kind of a sorted path. So at first, I mean, so I like to use the application sorry, I'm jumping around, but the application I'm working on is called Yim. It's a call center application, and it's going to replace Yuma. And I got to choose the name Yim because I like to use Vim. And getting Vim to not like spit out errors for JSX took me longer than any single component that I've written for React. It took me like a solid week to come up with a set of tools, plugins, and declarations that would actually recognize and like autocomplete and not balk at the syntax. So React is declarative. It uses JSX. It's at the heart of React is the notion of components. Like you're writing components for everything. Like every single thing you can come up with should be a component. And its efficiency is because they've developed this notion of a virtual DOM that sits outside of the actual DOM, and they manipulate it or they do a diff on it before they actually touch the DOM. So this is the declarative nature of JSX that I was talking about. You can see that you have a little bit of HTML sprinkled inside of your view, which if you come from the backbone, handlebars, some sort of templating language, this is kind of almost like unheard of. You were supposed to like separate things out, but React's components actually do a really nice job of like encapsulating the entire piece of functionality a piece of UI has. So you have your actions, you have your view or your UI component, all in one place. So it makes it really easy to test as well. So these are the two top-level APIs from React. I mean, there are more, but these are the ones you really need to know about. There's a third one that, if you've ever wanted to do isomorphic apps, you can actually turn an entire React application into a string and then spit that out to the browser. So it's also enabling, the development of rendering on the server the exact same code base that you have in your client. So this is actually a component. It uses JSX. And to get this onto the page, you actually just say react.render, and you pass it the two things that you want to render. In a real application, this hello world would be, like many, many components, but this is just a simple example. But you pass it the component, which would be your app. It can have a piece of data, like this date right here. It's a simple, silly example. And then you just pass it the DOM node that you want it to render to. All right, so the virtual DOM. I learned more about the virtual DOM. I still don't, I'm by no means an expert. There's, Facebook's React framework is like 300 lines or 300K. It's the closest thing that I came to comprehending this framework was in this little, well, that didn't work. Oh, here we go. I might not have internet. Oh.
You can use Wi-Fi code to link right under the buttons there.
Under these buttons?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just the factory, all lower.
It's trying to do something, I guess.
I'm waiting for it.
Well, these slides are posted, but basically the virtual DOM is you saw the render method in that component. What React does is it renders your app, and it keeps a reference of that, but it doesn't actually. So it renders some HTML or some DOM nodes, but it keeps a reference to that original like object structure, like your entire like all your DOM nodes and the data that are binded to it. And then it goes ahead and renders. And then when you change some piece of data, it does a diff on it says, okay, what's this new DOM gonna look like? And instead of manipulating the DOM, it does the diff first, and then it creates a patch. It's kind of like I guess like Git in a sense. And it takes that patch and it applies it to the DOM. So the updates are really, really selective, and so it's super efficient. It's essentially like you're re-rendering the whole app. You have a chance every time you change data to change class names or text in the inside of a tag, or pretty much anything. The gist is that this virtual DOM allows you not to have to, or it, I can't get off this page.
I think if you click use code, then you might be able to connect.
I did once. It doesn't seem to do anything.
Is it?
The factory? Whatever. I have a link to these slides, which actually point that you can get to on our GitHub, and it's in the last slide, so you'll see it. So this is a quote by Jeremy Ashkenazi, who is the founder or creator of Backbone. And I saw Jeremy and the creators of Ember and Angular in this conference in Toronto. It's called the Throne of JS. And 3 years ago, when I was trying to decide on which framework to use, I had the opportunity to go to this and make a kind of informed decision. And I really liked how Jeremy was like very unopinionated. His tool, his library was just a tool, and you could use it alongside any other tools that you chose. And so, he was standing head to toe with Tom Dale, and I forget some of the guys from Angular, but they were all attacking him. And so when I saw him kind of attacking Flux and Facebook, I was like, I think he's feeling a little threatened by all this. So that's when I really decided to take a look and invest some time in Flux. So what is it? It's an application architecture. It's this idea of unidirectional data flow. And I'm going to get into this, but basically, views link to actions. Actions fire events. Those events have callbacks inside of the stores. The stores do their magic, whether it's validating data or sending it off to a server. And then they fire off events, and the views come back and but grab the data back from the store. Hopefully, the next few slides will make this a little clearer, if you're confused. So here's a store. So that would be this piece here in this flow, in the Flux flow. And essentially, what I was saying is this store or model, there's no difference. The semantics are different, but essentially this is your data store. This is where all your business logic would be held. Is registering with a dispatcher. There's one dispatcher throughout your entire application, and when an action happens, any store in your entire application has a chance to react to those events. And you can see that here in this switch statement. There's this constant here that's being passed around. So inside of a view, so this is a controller view. The controller views are kind of like controllers in the sense that they're going to bring all of your other components together. And they're going to grab the data from the data stores, and they're going to pass it off to the views, the smaller views, like the subviews. This just simplifies. You know exactly where you have to bind your events. You know where your actions are going to take place. So you have an input, which is just another component. The semantics are, a view is just the dumbest piece of code that you could possibly have. It's just your UI. And it's instantiated or brought into your application in your view controller. So your view controller has references to your data. Your data is infused to this dumb view, and then your view controller is also handled. So like in this example, there's a submit, there's an on submit of this form, right? So this input could be anything. You could be an image gallery or whatnot, and then your view controller could have buttons for here and there. And it would actually be your view controller would be the actual thing that's interacting with your actions, which is going to continue this loop and finish the loop by getting the data out of the data store. Sure.
You can expand blow it up a little bit.
I'm using this presentation framework that's
scaling it down.
Yeah. So it's using the transform property, so every time I scale it, it's scaling back down.
Where can we find it on GitHub? Walk through it with you.
Yeah, so let me shoot to 56.
They don't make public info on their site.
So, can you see that?
Yeah.
Is it possible to use the built-in scaling on the Mac to do that?
That's what I'm trying to do.
Oh, it's
Accessibility is control. Use an accessibility magnifier.
Can everyone? who wants to download this? Someone who's downloading this, let me know when you've got it. You got it? I don't know what slide I was on. All right, so view controller, simple view component. So here in this flow we have these controllers. We talked about the stores and their events. Now we're on a view component, which is like these super simple UI components that are just responsible for rendering the data. And then the view controller also has a reference to these actions right here. So when an event fires off, it's going to call a method in this action object. And the act. This is going well. Okay, so we recovered. So anyway, here's an action. Typically, so as my application has grown.
Pretty dark.
Oh shoot.
Dark action.
It's plugged in.
Hold on.
Here we go.
Take 5.
All right. So your actions have a reference to the dispatcher. The dispatcher is going to take a string, if you were thinking about events, it'd be the event type, and some data or some action, that it's going to propagate through all your stores. And then, so this is a dispatcher that there is an actual object that does a lot of things that has, event capabilities, but essentially, you never interface with that. You only write the controller views, the actions, and then the stores. And inside of the stores where the dispatcher does its thing. So you can see right here that there's this dispatcher wait for. And this is in the case where two pieces of data, or two stores are reliant on the same piece of data. This brings me to one of my biggest gotchas when I was developing this, is that, so you have all these stores, you have all these components. And stores, from my past experience, you should never have two references to the exact same piece of data. It just seems like it would lead to a bug somewhere. But it's quite common because of the problem of having all these stores is that they can have circular references. So if you have a store A that references store B and store B references store A, well, one of those isn't going to load before the other one needs it. So this led me to the idea of priming all of my data stores and then pumping them into each other. So I was familiar with Angular, and I'd seen a bit of code, how they wrote their dependency injection. So I just stole that and added it into my application. And this is common. I've seen this, people have done it other ways. There's this notion of having a data store that has all of your prime datas, or sorry, all of your prime stores. And then in each store, you just have a data store object that you say, get me this store, get me that store. And so I've dealt with that in the past with backbone applications where collections had dependencies on each other. Like if you had, say like, in our case, we have facilities, and facilities have units. You would have a facility collection that had a unit collection. But in certain situations, you were kind of in a circular, like there was just no possible way that the dependencies could resolve themselves without coming up with some sort of way to prime everything first and then run your application. So this is a simple container. I've abbreviated most of it, but the gist is that it has a collection of dependencies, and then which are registered, and then there's a process. So in your app.js, you would create the problem with Flux data stores is they're not actually objects. They're objects, but they're not classes. They're object literals, and that's because they have a public API that the view controllers reach into and grab. And you don't want to have every store be a singleton so that you can have the same piece of data referenced throughout your application. So in inside your app.js file, you bring in all your stores, and then you just call process on them. You register them with the container, and the container processes them. And there's inside of each store, there's an inject method. This is a little weird. This is not traditional like dependency injection. In every other probably language or wherever you've seen this, it would be in a constructor. But like I said, these are object literals. They don't have a constructor. So I had to kind of massage the framework to my own purposes. But it worked. It solved my problem. The other problem I came about was that React is this great framework, but it doesn't really allow you to have the separation of like concerns when it comes to different logical pieces of functionality, like a facility page or a user page or whatnot. So routers have become a big part of the ecosystem. The very first one I came across was React Router. When I realized that my application was growing out of control and I needed to implement some sort of routing mechanism, I found this, but React was like at 0.8 or 9 or something like that. I forget, it was like 4 or 5 months ago. And when I upgraded last week to React, the latest release, React Router doesn't support it, so I had to go searching. The second one I found was the React Router component, and this worked, so I implemented this. I was like running through my unit tests, and everything was passing except for one thing, my router store. When events were happening throughout the application, and I wanted to see state in the URL so that I could deep link into my app. So when for like testing, or if like an app crashed, you could always, or like for bookmarking, the things that are fairly common on the web today, the React Router crowd hadn't implemented it yet. So it was up to me to find a different tool or build it myself. And so luckily I found the mini React Mini, whatever. And it actually worked. So, and it's very similar to Backbone's routing system. There's a route property on your, it adds a route property, or you add a route property to your, like your app, and then it takes it's an object, so it takes a property and a string value for a function within your application. All right, so, and this is how I implemented, so in my application, I had this route store, just like everything else. As events were happening throughout the application, this route store was listening for basically everything. If you went to book something, or if you went to make a call, or if you went to send some favorite emails or whatnot, it was all captured in the URL. And so it made perfect sense to put it in the store, because that's where all these events were flowing through, instead of having it littered throughout, in my booking store, or in my start store, or anywhere else. I had this one data store that was, so basically I had to, when I was swapping in and out these routers, it was fairly easy because I had my app and I had my route store, and I only had to modify slightly the syntax for each one of these different ones. So it was a huge win that I found something, and that, like I wasn't stuck using an old version of React and these old libraries. Which brings up another good point. None of these tools are at a full release. I mean, not even Node is at a full release. So you're gonna feel some pain. I'm pretty sure React's going to come out with a full release. It seems like they've hardened their API in this last release, and it's and then it'll just be like hardware to software. The hardware is outpacing the software, and it'll be a few months before all these different routing or all these other pieces that kind of help you get your job done catch up. The other thing, and this one probably is typical of anything, but the cycle is the same. Like you write a store, and then you write some view components, and then you write some actions, and it's like every time we write a new UI feature, I know I'm going to have to touch the exact same files. I know exactly what I'm going to have to do. So it's not really a gotcha or anything. It's just like sometimes it's boring. And then this is the one that blows my mind. Somewhere in the React code, and I haven't dug into it, it's suppressing errors. Like, maybe it's because I'm using npm and I haven't figured out how to install the development version. It hasn't been that big of a deal, but sometimes they must have wrapped everything in their view rendering inside some try catch. And because I'm using the production version, it just doesn't throw errors. So debugging can be somewhat difficult. All right, so what else? Their documentation. I mean, this is one of the reasons I chose this tool is because it is awesome. Like, they have examples, they have a blog, they have videos, they speak at conferences. This second link is a collection of awesome libraries. Like when I was researching this presentation and when I've been looking for whether it's routers or anything on the React ecosystem, you should definitely check this out. There's a list of like 100 different GitHub repositories. I mentioned isomorphic apps. React is great at this. Like you can render it in the browser, you can render it on the server. It brings you closer to having one code base, whether you're in the node world or in the browser world. Immutable data. This is something that I'm only starting to now get into. This is Facebook's immutable data library. There's another one I saw just yesterday that I didn't actually get into this presentation. But being that your view controllers are reaching into your stores and just pulling out data and not ever, they don't have any chance to manipulate it. That means immutable data is probably the place to be. There's this other library called Ohm, or there's a React Ohm implementation. And I'll put both these other libraries that I know about in this slide deck at some point, probably tonight or tomorrow. But it's like, Ohm has this notion of your entire application state is stored in one immutable object. And so it makes the rendering of your application immensely fast. Like React is already super fast, but I can't speak from experience, but that's what they told me. All right, so here's another quote from Jeremy Ashkenaz, and this is probably true. All right, that's it. Any questions? Sorry. Yeah.
So I was really curious about isomorphic apps with React,
Yeah.
Particularly how people use server-side rendering and bringing it up to the front, the client side. Can you describe a little bit of the process of how a blob of HTML generated by React on the server side somehow becomes magically connected with everything?
Well, you're executing it twice, basically. On the server, you're not executing the eventing. Like if you've read, what is it? Airbnb basically is using React on the server, and they wrote their own eventing APIs. Because they've gone kind of the way that Twitter did like a year ago, where they were like, rendering everything on the client is silly. It wasn't performant enough. So Airbnb has a great blog post in this collection of resources about how they're just using React to render on the server, and then they wrote a very simple client-side eventing object, like event bus or whatever they did, that actually submits forms to their backend. And so when I went about implementing, because I was like, I want to do this. It sounds so fun, because when I heard about Meteor, I was like, that'd be so cool. But it's actually not that cool. The only thing that I can see that it really like if speed is of the essence to you, like if you need to get that first page up and running in someone's browser, like for games or something, you're going to render that entire application on the server, and then you're going to send it to the browser, and then you're going to execute basically the same code. But React's smart enough not to re-render everything. It knows that if there's a DOM node, because it's got this virtual DOM, it knows that it's already in state, like the state is correct. So all it's going to do is now be listening for events. So you're going to kind of have an execution on the client, but it's going to be kind of like a no-op. It's basically going to be like, oh, we're cool. So was it worth it for me? There was this letdown. I was like, oh, I have to execute the same code twice. But then I realized a day later, I was like, well, yeah, you have to. So I guess, like I was saying, if that initial payload where you deliver all this HTML should include all your data objects, then yeah, go ahead. Build out your whole list of properties or whatever your game state in pre-rendered HTML, and then just attach all your events. But I didn't. I actually ripped that code out because I thought this was silly. But now that I think about it a little more, you're not going to have to make all those API requests. So if you have a page that has 15 different widgets and they all rely on a different API endpoint, you don't have to, initially you don't have to do all that. It's going to come with your...
And can you switch after that to just do it on the client?
Yeah, it's totally, it's not, yeah. I mentioned Airbnb because they decided not to use a minimal amount of JavaScript in the client, but what I was doing was it was the exact same. Like once it was in the browser, it was a single page app. It was using the same router, it was using the same stores, it was using the same everything.
You're just priming it with the initial view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you deal with all the minor versions with, I'm assuming you're running in production.
We're close. We haven't actually released it
I'm
yet.
wondering if you keep up to date with every update.
I try to. My boss doesn't think I should. So last week, so we're on a sprint cadence, like 2 weeks, whatever. And on Fridays we do planning, and since I didn't have anything to do, I was like, I'm gonna upgrade to 0.12. I was at like 0.10 or 11 or whatnot. And there were a few major changes, especially with my third-party dependencies. And when I went to my stand-up on Friday, I forget if it was Friday or Monday, they asked me what I'd been doing. I was like, I'm upgrading to the latest version of React. And there was actually some anger in his voice, I think. He was like, why? Are we gonna have to do this? It took me a day. I mean, to stay current, especially, I mean, I chose these frameworks. I chose to do it in Node and React and Flux. So, I mean, it's on me. If I can't keep, I don't want this project to languish and wither and die before we even get a release. So it's kind of on you as a developer if you choose these experimental technologies to, I guess, stay abreast to when they're updated and then either rewrite components or just wait until it's a full release. I mean, that's what I'd actually recommend for anyone it's going to happen pretty soon. But I was kind of chomping at the bit to try something new.
So React does a good job at combining your HTML with your JavaScript and creating a very reusable component, right?
Yeah.
Now my question is, have you come up with any creative ways to bring CSS into the mix and make that combined with the same component, maybe using BEM methodologies or otherwise?
What was the last part, BEM?
BEM, like block element modifier. Like,
oh.
Are you having a good way to like build your components, to build your CSS components, really, like tie that CSS to the component in such a way that it's very clear how it's organized?
Yeah. Well, so this is the application I've been working on. And in my router, well, in my app, responding to router changes or route changes, I wrap the entire application. Can you see? Well, this is tiny probably.
No.
You see that class on the body, app.intro, here?
Yeah.
So when I move to another page, I don't have internet. Why don't I have internet? Yeah, anyway, so every time there's a transition from one route to the next, there's my router, my app is listening to those changes, and it actually looks at the route itself in the URL, and it just basically takes the path and separates it by strings and adds it to the body class. So I have in my CSS, where, let me full screen this. Hold on. Man, this is small. So each one of my components is wrapped inside of those namespaces in a sense. You can't see that, can you?
Big it 400.
So is there like a one-to-one correlation? Like you have one file for one component?
Yeah.
Thing for CSS?
Yeah. And if there's a shared component, like this booking, when you're not on this page and you're actually on the phone with a customer, you're actually seeing storage, kind of like Airbnb style. There's like a list of storage available in your area and a map. And this booking tile over here on the right is minimized down to the right, but it's the exact same tile, or it's the exact same UI. I just, with these like namespace classes, wrap those different, so if it's on the intro page, it's a third of the page, and then if it's on any other page, the nesting of the classes such that I could pin it down to the right and minimize some of the fields and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone's been using them in tandem with React, like to keep the specificity low on CSS and make sure that the component works well with it in any place that you use it.
Well, so I've been using, the other thing I discovered recently was this notion of modular CSS or something like that, where every component basically has, instead of using multiple classes, each one is very specific. So each one of my classes, let me get into one of these. Oh, forget it, just the header. So like the header is yum header, instead of being just like a generic header class. And then for the logo, and then as you get down deeper and deeper, it's like yum logo letter, yum logo syllable,
right.
Something like that.
It keeps
yeah, so I can move these pieces anywhere I want, and the CSS should apply.
Yeah,
sometimes I have to change. What's that?
Even if you didn't know you were using it, that's pretty bad. So.
Yeah.
My understanding of React, the larger your application gets, you inevitably have this really deep hierarchical component tree. Is that right? Because everything is a component essentially, right?
Yeah. Well, the router helps. I mean, so on different, so each route will have its own dependency, like each component tree, and so that was what it kind of meant when I said separation of concerns. Like at some point I realized that it was going to get really, really complex. Like everything was going to be on the page, and that's when, and I think other people have realized that. React actually, some of their applications, I forget which one, use Backbone, their routers, to I think accomplish some of the same things.
Okay.
I think it's Instagram used Backbone's router initially. I'm sure they've come up with something since.
Yeah, I think they did. I remember hearing that. So was your app built from the ground up, or were you using other technologies and then you introduced React?
It was built from the ground up.
Okay.
React was the very first component.
Could you imagine incorporating React pretty easily into an existing system like with your prior?
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to do was use React instead of Backbone's view layer. And when I was researching React, I came across the Flux literature, and I was like, "Whoa, I might as well try this." And it worked out really well.
And it doesn't interfere, because I know that.
I'm not using Backbone at all.
Right. Yeah. Right. But it doesn't interfere, theoretically, because I know React basically uses virtual events, right? It captures every single event at the top. Would that not get in the way with other?
I think you would just have to switch over it completely.
I can say something on that. I'm actually using some React components within a Backbone app.
Okay.
And actually, because React is componentized, it's very easy to integrate into other apps, because you can just create a component that does one specific thing, and then it does that and nothing else, and the rest of your app does something different. So it's actually pretty easy to integrate it in with other.
Okay, and it knows not to capture the events that don't belong to components or something?
Well, it's just going to look for events on that component, right? So it may attach, it may be watching for events at the top level, at the body, but it's only going to, if you're looking for a click event on your component, it's not going to take a click event from somewhere else.
I gotcha.
It's only going to take a click event from that container. Basically, all the components are going to be in a container, right? So they're contained in their section of the DOM, and it's only really cares about events happening in that section of the DOM.
I see. Okay. Thanks.
I thought I had connectivity here for a second. Anyway, any other questions?
So you said your stores were just object literals, right?
Yeah.
So where do you keep your web API logic?
In the stores. You mean like the API, like the endpoint?
Like an XHR connection somewhere. Where is that being located? So like to keep like your models in sync with. So if a store is a model, you might have a corresponding like REST endpoint.
Yeah.
So how do you keep them in sync? Do you write like a custom Ajax solution would do that, or like backbone models would?
Oh yeah. So this is an internal app. So we get to determine what software we run, and so we're running Chrome, and so I'm just using like the native XHR request object that I wrapped in with some events, so I can tell when it starts, stops, and ends, and all that stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I imagine you could use jQuery just as easily inside your. I just didn't want to have
So
any.
if you have like a complicated like REST endpoint, you're going to manage your posts and your puts. And...
Yeah, I mean that would be a case where you'd probably like using Backbone again, because you'd have these collections and it maps almost one-to-one with a REST API. But that was one of the cool things when we were deciding to do this. Like not having to use jQuery for anything is kind of liberating. Like the only dependencies that I have outside of React are like Moment.js because it's awesome, and ES6 promises, and this. What else do I have? Most of these are my build dependencies, but and then there's Express because I'm serving up. But yeah, Moment, Request, and just Moment really. What else? So it's nice because you're using JSX. You don't have to query. You're not doing a lot of DOM selections. You're not doing a lot of DOM manipulation. Instead of having to manage all these events that you do in Backbone, and instead of having to like do all these DOM manipulations that you do in like a jQuery app or something like that, React does most of that for you. It handles the view for you. You manage the state, you set those properties, you change some state properties, and it renders things, and you don't have to worry about manipulation.
I had sort of an open question about how do you think web components might affect how you use your frameworks? Particularly React looks very sort of component oriented. Is virtual DOM appropriate for all problems, or is there really practical benefits you get out of it, and even just like in a simple scenarios, or?
Well, it's 300K, so in a simple solution, I probably wouldn't choose it. But for a large-scale application, sure, I would definitely. Or in a Backbone app, if you're sick of working with the events, like having to bind and update things. I mean, like Ember and Angular have come at those at different ways, but you could easily stick with a Backbone app and just use React for your view layer. I would say if it's not a single page app, or if it's not a rich internet app, or somewhere like I don't know where the dividing line is, that it's not really. It might not be, if download, like if the package or the dependencies that you're offloading onto a user are a concern, and it's not like an immersive app. It might not be the case, but who am I to say?
So, do you find it like, is it easier to develop once you know it? Or
yeah, it is. JSX, the syntax is a little wonky to begin with. Like, you can't use class on a DOM element. You have to use class name, and it doesn't render ASCII characters. You have to use Unicode, and there's a lot of stuff like that. But the documentation is great. It actually will spit out errors. Like if you've used something that they can catch, it'll alert you in the console. So like I forget, there are no good examples going to come to mind, but it's fairly easy to adopt there, especially if you're writing an app. Like after 2 days, I was pretty comfortable.
Well, so if you said you had to write it on a different thing, like let's say just from scratch, would you be faster to do it on something else, or on this? Like, is it like way easier? You say like, oh my god, it was like 2 weeks less time because I did it on this.
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I've kept pace with no one's been telling me I have to move at a faster pace. So I would say it's a great framework. It allows you to be more productive, but I can't really quantify that. And the other thing is, like, if you don't like the syntax, you don't have to use JSX. It's a convenience. You run your like React files through a transpiler, and it spits out just regular old JavaScript. I mean, it's an extension of JavaScript, but Facebook is in no way trying to get JSX into browsers. It's just a flavor that you have to process before you send it to a client.
I would definitely say that's one of the strong points for us. Switching. Try to debug a handlebar error, right, or anything like that. I mean, with JSX, you can place well balanced breakpoints or debuggers and kind of get to the root of maybe why a component's not rendering correctly. Exactly, yeah. So when you end up with this, with JX, translate it to just objects. It's a lot easier to see what's going on. So.
If you guys need a job, SpareFoot.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for coming. You're free to hang out here for another hour. We have the room until 9 o'clock, so just ask you to pick up after yourself and come next month. I think we'll be talking about D3 next month, so it's good.